It is the 17th of August, 2018, and this is episode 93 of the Unseen Podcast. Tonight's episode will be our summer hiatus non-episode, so we're still going to call it an episode, just to be confusing. Joining me tonight are David Grigg.
Hi from Australia.
Mike Bohler.
Hello.
Nick Nielsen.
Hello from Portland, Oregon.
And Sam Lichtenstein.
Yo.
Very New York. Okay. And so, David, you had some thoughts about some topics. Why don't we start with you?
Okay. It was really, I came across an article online. I can't remember now how I stumbled across it, but the heading of the article was "Why We Should Think Twice About Colonizing Space," and the author is someone called Phil Torres. And I'm not sure I can really summarize the argument exactly, but he basically seems to be saying it's not a great idea for us to go out and into space and colonize other star systems because eventually everybody will start to diverge from the standard of what people are like on Earth and what cultures are like on Earth, and that for some reason seems like a bad thing. Am I summarizing that reasonably well, Nick, or what do you think?
Yeah. He maintains that there will be both biological and ideological divergence over long periods of cosmological time that will result in highly diverse civilizations that would be in a Hobbesian war of all against all, and this would actually be bad for humanity as compared to staying on Earth, where he implies but doesn't exactly say that we've more or less got a handle on this thing. But the interesting thing about Phil Torres' argument is unlike a lot of people who talks about existential risk, you can tell by reading the article, he's actually read the sources. He cites Milan Cherkovich and he cites Nick Bostrom and their calculations of the potential number of lives and why this is a moral imperative to expand into space. And so he takes that argument head on, and he says, the longer we delay, the better. And if we delay indefinitely, that's best of all, because if we expand out, it's going to cause divergence is going to cause conflict, and conflict is going to be a bad thing.
He seems to be making this. I read the article very quickly, so I apologize if I'm mischaracterizing it. But he seems to be making some more precise claims about the nature of, say, interplanetary or interstellar conflict as opposed to within planet conflict. For example, he asserts that there's reason to be skeptical that modes of deterrence that prevent warfare on Earth are less likely to function on a larger scale. I'm not sure what I think about that, but
it seems to me that's a pretty silly argument, because part of the problem is that if you are colonizing different solar systems, the distances between those civilizations is so great that carrying out any sort of warfare is almost inconceivable. I would have thought.
Well, not only that, but what have they got to fight over? I mean, if you're
that's right.
If you're 10 light years away,
you
have no resources in common.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, most conflicts in the past have been over, as you say, resources or living space.
I think that's why he specifies that ideological divergence, which would result in ideologically based conflict.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it struck me it struck me that the novels of Jack Vance, the science fiction stories of Jack Vance, are exactly set in that kind of galactic world where humanity has diverged all over the place and cultures have diverged very radically. And it's only a science fiction story, but it seems to me that he's seeing that as a kind of positive multiculturalism that would exist in his future galaxy. So yeah, I wasn't at all convinced by this argument, but
also sort of presents a similar positive multicultural. Well, just one, the culture, but like it is sort of cosmopolitan, and I guess Star Wars and Star Trek are both have some similar features.
Yeah, it's hardly a new concept. But I suppose just from taking a sort of high level, I was just interested in the whole concept that there are people out there who don't think that going out into space or visiting other planets or trying to visit other solar systems is necessarily a good thing. There's an argument to be made, I guess, but I don't know that Phil Torres has actually done that in his article.
What argument do you think is to be made, David? Do you have a handle on that?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you think there is?
I didn't catch it.
Do you have an argument? Can you summarize an argument that could be made?
I think the argument to be made is the one that Hawking makes and lots of other people make, is that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. The Earth is a reasonably vulnerable place. We're living awfully close to this big star. We can get hit by all sorts of chunks of matter that are floating around in the solar system. If we want humanity to survive, and perhaps there's a case to be made that we don't want humanity to survive, but if we do want humanity and human culture to survive, then we do have to go to other places and have backups. It's like backing up your data. You want your data in as many places as possible.
Right. Yeah. Now,
and you want your biosphere in as many places as possible.
Is there a better argument than Torres's for not doing that, or?
Well, I suppose a common argument, I don't know if it's better, is that the resources could be better used somehow improving marginal odds of survival through improvements on Earth rather than investing.
The old why are we spending it on space when there are people starving on Earth?
Yeah, I don't think it's a great argument, but it's at least something one should confront, probably, if you're...
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's always... I always thought that was a cynical argument, but,
It's an argument that's always been made about almost anything, really, isn't it? That we can't do such and such because we haven't solved all our problems here on Earth right now. But if you use that argument, you're never going to do anything.
Right. I mean,
but people make it utopia about nuclear power, for example, right? People argue that we could invest a lot of resources in converting our energy grid from fossil fuels to nuclear power, and that might have some sort of existential risk benefits. And other people argue in more or less good faith that that's not the most efficient use of resources, and sort of there are alternative pathways towards, say, a fossil fuel-free energy grid, if that's the objective you're going for, that are just more efficient, and so you should pursue those instead.
Well, right. I mean, you can make
context. I think it's often made in bad faith, but I don't think it's intrinsically a bad faith argument.
Well, you can always make an engineering argument that X is a better solution than Y, but I've heard people say, when you ask them point blank, what if a completely pollution-free energy source was available? Would you be in favor of it? A lot of them are not.
Why would you not? Why would you not be in favor of it?
Because they fear the expansion of human civilization and economic growth. They don't want that. They have this noble savage idea that we should go back to the land.
Well, there are also people who argue for voluntary human extinction.
I didn't mean to diverge us into the possibly irrational forms of environmentalism that are out there. Like in the context of the survival of humanity, you can imagine, for example, some people might believe the biggest risk we face is, say, conflict stemming from economic inequality, economic inequality. And so if you believe that's somehow the first problem we should be working on, that is probably not most effectively addressed via space colonization, right? And therefore you might make what Paul characterized as an engineering argument that right now, under the current circumstances, it's not the best engineering solution to back up humanity rather than addressing more immediate forms of risk.
I think that's a reasonable argument. And I think the thing we also need to think about is that we're actually a hell of a long way away from having the capability of having a colony in a different world, which is completely independent from supply from Earth. That would take would be a huge step. I don't think we're there yet. And the thing is that no matter how many people we might get living on Mars, you're never going to be able to evacuate the Earth if we have an environmental catastrophe. The other article I linked to in the pre-discussion was that Nick did was about the danger of the positive feedback cycles on the current climate change issue, where that as we push the temperature up, we start to hit dangerous positive feedback cycles, which may drive us into a completely new state of the climate on Earth, which may not at all be consonant with human existence, or certainly human civilization. So if we stuff up the Earth badly enough, we're still quite a long way away from being able to rescue society or rescue humanity from our own bad decisions in the past.
Right. Well, I mean, space colonization wouldn't necessarily rescue Western civilization, but it might rescue the species.
Backup, not a redundant disk array. It's just the backup that you can restore from.
No evacuation plan.
Yeah.
Just a plan B, as it were.
It would be easier to back up our data elsewhere than human beings, I guess.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, but my concern is that I think we're, the notion of there are things that could destroy life on Earth that have nothing to do with poor choices by humanity.
That's true.
And there are some things that could destroy any life in the solar system, whatever, but those are much less likely. Like a nearby supernova or some such thing. But a big comet comes out of nowhere, and there's absolutely nothing we can do to stop it, and it could wipe out Western civilization. And even foreseeably 50, 60 years from now, we won't be able to stop it. The question. So there are risks that policy choices won't influence.
It's interesting that both of these, however, can be addressed as the kind of engineering choices you mentioned earlier in relation to energy supply, because we can cast this as, are we closer to being able to divert existential threats from our home world technologically, or are we technologically closer to be able to creating a self-sustaining human community off of Earth that could continue to function?
I don't think it's either or, but
yeah, I agree, and in fact, I would argue that having a robust spacefaring presence would be our best defense against things like comets, asteroids, gamma ray bursts, et cetera.
You're going to have to hide somewhere pretty damn safe for a gamma ray burst.
Yeah, we don't think there's a likely gamma ray burst nearby, but it could. We're always finding new things out there, but
what about a sufficiently big coronal mass ejection?
Yeah, that's another favorite existential risk of mine.
Well, that could take down power grids. It's probably not going to.
What about just the high energy protons? Wouldn't that be enough to irradiate everything?
I don't think that's going to. No, that's not going to be.
They're not going to through the atmosphere.
Well, imagine 7 billion human beings trying to live on Earth without electricity. That's going to go bad really quickly, and they're going to be left with about 2 or 3 billion people.
Well, you could rebuild the power grid.
You're out by a factor of 1,000. I reckon you would have 2 million people if you were lucky.
Yeah, you could rebuild the infrastructure, but it will take time.
Yeah,
the number of people you have who know how to build a power station, who know how to build high tension electrical wires. I mean, how many of those would be among the survivors of the initial disruption to food and water supplies?
Well, I think that's an argument for having lots of distributed energy sources, right?
I agree.
Like solar power.
Well, implicitly, the terrestrial, without any attempt to put it to a vote, the global electricity grid has been built around big power stations and long distance delivery. And if we had chosen a different paradigm of a lot of small stations and no long distance delivery, the problem would be less extreme.
All that said, does anybody know a good reference on the actual numerics of how worried to be about global power supply disruption from a geomagnetic storm or?
Well, I mean, in Canada, they have experienced things like that. Now
Sure, but not on a massively disruptive scale, right?
No, but Canada's more vulnerable than Canada and Russia are more vulnerable than, say, equatorial areas, because there you get a very, very rapid fluctuation in the magnetic field that can induce massive currents in their power grid, and the result is heavy damage. But they have seen that before. Now, Canada also has really bad winters, which results in the need to distribute energy, but they also have a lot of gas and other types of ways of heating. So they're not completely 100% delicate, but they would suffer certainly from a really big CME, like a historic level CME.
Which there's no reason to think won't happen again.
Well, yeah, there actually have been some papers written on what are called Carrington events, which are these really big solar storms, or which can, I'm not sure if there's a difference between really big solar storms and ones that coronal mass ejections, or if a coronal mass ejection is what happens when it gets really, really big when there's a solar storm, but both can interrupt electricity or destroy electricity grids on the Earth. And the worst one on record being the 1859 Carrington event that actually caught some telegraph operators on fire because of the surge down the line.
Yep.
And if this happens with a modern electrical grid, it would be catastrophic.
But is there some sense of, do people have an estimate for whether the Carrington event was a once in a century, I mean, obviously, without any information, you'd guess it's about once in 150 years, because it was about 150 years ago. So your call should be that the arrival time should be about the time since we've seen it. But seems like physics should be able to constrain the frequency with which such troublesome phenomena could occur.
If we understood the physics of these storms well, which we don't yet. I know a lot more about them we used to, but still, it's a pretty modern development that we have any handle on solar dynamics at all.
But there were probably really bad events in the past, but since we didn't have an electrical grid, they weren't detected. We didn't know about it.
No.
Because things that would not kill human beings could easily destroy the electrical grid.
But
so we don't.
Awesome northern lights, and people would have thought the gods were at war or something.
Yeah, if you have good weather, you might see the northern lights. But pretty far south, maybe Italy or someplace like that. But we don't have a good record of it, in my opinion.
No, we don't. We as Nick says, it could have happened once every 50 years in medieval times, and nobody would have known. We still wouldn't know.
True. Yeah. I mean, they weren't even using magnetic navigation for until relatively recently. So and even that would only be probably a brief interruption. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. It kind of reminds me of this whole debate about how likely is technological life in the galaxy. Are we the only example? Well, we think that there's nothing special about us, but we could that could be a bias from being the lottery winner, right? It's entirely possible that a Carrington event is extremely rare. We just happen to catch one.
Yeah, well, we
I
don't
wonder
know.
if there are some scientists who spend their time thinking about trying to find proxies that allow you to indirectly measure subgeological scale fluctuations in the magnetic field. Like, for example, there's bacteria that have iron, I think carry extremely high concentrations of iron. I wonder whether like fossilized bacteria would show striations related to magnetic phenomena.
There is evidence of that the Earth's magnetic field has reversed north to south pole a number of times in the past, and you do detect it using exactly what you've suggested.
Repeatedly, and one wonders if the same methods could be used to detect a magnetic storm. It would be very interesting to know if somebody's pursued that. The other thing was
the time scale is probably too short to show up.
That seems like the concern. Yeah, it's much shorter than the pole reversal time scale. Is tens of thousands of years.
I think it's about 50,000 years, give or take. Another line of research that could be pursued, it would be observing other stars and seeing how often they have sun-like stars, and see how often they have violent events that put out disproportionate amounts of electromagnetic radiation.
Right, because then you have a huge sample size. That's
exactly.
Yeah. Well, we're going to actually get that data, I think.
Didn't they just detect one on Proxima Centauri?
Yeah, but that's not a very sun-like star. But
no.
The European Plato mission will be looking at a lot of sun-like stars, not continuously, but they'll have a lot of data about sun-like stars, and it'll be quite sensitive because they're fairly close to the Earth compared to Kepler.
It seems like the Department of Homeland Security should be funding these missions because obviously this information is highly relevant to our national security.
Well, it's to our planetary security, yeah. But I
think that actually makes sense because it also ties in with the fact that the Russians have been detected hacking into power stations and power grids and all sorts of stuff. So it is a national security issue.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, I doubt the Department of Homeland Security thinks much beyond what other humans might do to us.
Yeah, I think their threat horizon is quite constricted compared to, say, NASA's Planetary Protection Office, which might be the appropriate entity, but they don't have the funding to do that kind of research.
Planetary Protection Office is very, very limited scope. I think that, they have like a few people. I think that FEMA really is the right agency in the U.S. to be looking at that. That it's not an aggressive threat from another nation. It's a natural disaster, possible natural disaster.
Does anybody know if FEMA does any kind of scientific studies into natural disasters?
NOAA does the work on solar weather, on space weather. I would hope that NOAA and FEMA are talking to each other about that. I don't think FEMA is really a science agency.
No,
but the science is being done by various people. NOAA is the leader in basically all weather, including space weather, and climate as well. So,
but it seems far from clear that there's actual kind of someone connecting the dots between the money that we allocate for protecting ourselves and the scientific inquiries that are in fact intimately related to this, although maybe not so obviously to Congress, Yeah,
well, I think a lot of cognitive biases come into threat assessment. I think that people have discussed threat assessment in the light of cognitive bias because human threat assessment is often very poor. I mean, running away from tigers, but very poor from avoiding sweet foods or fatty foods, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
I sometimes wonder whether if an asteroid was detected heading towards the Earth, whether you wouldn't have groups of people on Earth denying that there were such things happening and that we shouldn't be spending money or, trying to shut down the astronomical agencies. We should have detected it, or I'm being cynical, but looking at what's obviously.
I don't think that's cynical. I think it's very realistic.
Yeah. I mean, we've got an obvious existential threat with climate change, and yet we have massive denial. It's crazy.
I think that's fading, but yeah, it is still there. And
it's also of a slightly different nature insofar as if you had an asteroid, the Newtonian mechanics of calculating when it's going to hit are much more straightforward than the, calculating when the combined economic and environmental effects will reach some sort of tipping point.
Right. You don't have to explain averages to people. You just say the rock is going to hit us, and they get it.
183 days from now, or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a lot fewer degrees of freedom in that model.
I could even imagine if national governments saw any response to an existential catastrophe like that was deemed to be inevitable, I can imagine them shutting down the media just to avoid panic before it happened.
Yeah.
Well, what's the point of avoiding panic?
Because people who are in government jobs, that's what they fear. They fear even if it doesn't make any sense anymore. Even if it doesn't matter if people slaughter each other in the streets, I think they're still going to be averse to panic.
Yeah. Well, I always thought that was an interesting question. What would happen if we knew well in advance that there was a big disaster coming? Which is there's the famous Nevile Shute novel On the Beach, which was filmed as a movie. The first version.
In my hometown.
Right. In Australia, it's set in Australia, and one thing I find absolutely fascinating about that story. I haven't read the book, but I've watched the first movie version. I tried to watch the second movie version; it was awful. But the original one has Gregory Peck as the submarine captain. Anyway, in the film, it makes it clear that they are stockpiling suicide drugs for the population, but they won't give them out before the end is truly imminent. And they have people, and this point comes up repeatedly throughout the movie. When this one submariner jumps ship in San Francisco, it says he just wants to see his hometown. They ask him, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, are you ready for what's coming? It's, oh yeah, I visited a drugstore, something like that, and got what I need. So the idea is everybody's going to kill themselves, but don't do it too early. You have to live to the last minute, and then you can kill yourself. I don't know. I maybe I should read the book to try to get more insight in what the author was trying to get across. But it's very macabre in a way. At least I find it macabre.
Well, perhaps it was a way of saying that uncontrolled weaponry is a form of suicide. You might as well get it over with, right?
I think probably to be a bit more fair to the author, I think probably the idea was that you had this wave of radiation coming down from all the nuclear explosions in the northern hemisphere. You had this wave of radiation coming further and further south, and so it was coming towards Melbourne. And the idea would be that people would die horribly through the effects of radiation, and taking the pill was a more pleasant way out than waiting for the more horrible effects of it.
But why not let them take it early if they want to check out early?
Well, there'd be nothing to stop you, I guess.
Well, they had in the show. One of the characters in the show asked for the drugs to end it early, and the doctor refuses him or her. I can't remember which character it was.
Yeah, the Hippocratic Oath, professional ethics.
Well, maybe the thinking is there's always hope, and maybe that will be the case with the asteroid heading towards Earth. Maybe there's going to be some slight diversion, or we can explode a nuclear weapon on it and maybe nudge it out of its current direction. We might still survive, and so you wouldn't want panic happening if there was still a chance, however small, that it would actually miss.
Good point.
Or there could be intervention from another species.
Oh, right? Definitely.
God, perhaps.
Or we could close our eyes really hard and wish really, really, really strong and it'll go away.
Or just pray a lot. Well, just occurred to me that the existence of breakthrough starshot might actually be a way of doing that. Right? If you had gigawatts of laser power, you might be able to deflect it.
Well, so that reminds me of the other article that Nick, did you link it in the discussion? The Siegel piece, yeah.
Yeah, the Siegel piece.
So I'm kind of curious what you guys thought about that. I thought the whole thing seemed pretty innumerate. And so
it was pretty weak.
The probability that your astro chip hits a planet is like infinitesimal. You know, even if it doesn't matter what your cone is. You know, any plausible area we could be aiming at, the chance of a planet being where we actually hit strikes me as not the sort of thing an astrophysicist, you know, it's a rounding error in their calculations, right? But
it's not likely, but the bigger thing, I think, is that the people who actually spend time trying to design starships, and there are quite a few of them, all of the questions, all of the objections he brought up are things that people have literally spent years of their life working in unremunerated toil to address these things, like slowing down before you get to another star system, you know, not hitting your target, and what was the third objection? Oh, that the probe on its way to another star system would be damaged, therefore it couldn't be counted upon to act reliably once it reached its destination.
Self-destruct or something.
Yeah, so the first one strikes me as you have to live with it. The second one is extremely unlikely to happen, and the third one is just. I think the attitude of Breakthrough Starshot is you just have to live with it, right? You're not going to be able to slow it down, and you're not going to know it's going to work when it gets there. But why the hell? We should try anyway, right? I mean,
well, I don't think the Breakthrough Starshot could be large enough to cause damage to anything. However, later iterations of interstellar probes, I think, would be the potential problem. Though I still, like I said, I don't think it's much of a problem, because a larger probe that could pack any kind of instrumentation with it, time we have the technological capacity to launch it, we would have onboard AI with pretty robust capabilities to avoid starting interstellar incidents, as it were.
But his claim was that a 1 gram probe at 60,000 kilometers per second, that's pretty fast, would pack the same punch as a Chelyabinsk style rock, I think.
Which is not that bad, really. I mean, the amount of damage that caused was mainly through the shock effect, the shockwave effect, but it wasn't really a terribly dangerous thing. So, as you say, the odds of it actually hitting the planet, the odds of it hitting somewhere occupied, the odds of it actually having enough energy to cause problems, they're all pretty low. And I would have thought that given the universe is big, there probably are objects whizzing through space right now, natural objects which are probably going as fast, and the odds of them hitting a particular planet are probably pretty low. So I don't know that the aliens on wherever he said they were sending it, Alpha Centauri, are going to turn around and complain about us shooting at them. Really, doesn't seem very likely. But it was interesting.
But do any of you find the objections about not being able to slow down and do science, or be confident that we're going to get any signals back? Are those compelling objections from your point of view?
The only objection is if you could not or engineer a way that would if you cannot engineer a way for a really at least a plausibly reliable way of getting signals back, then you haven't solved the problem.
Why do it?
Yeah, I think you have to figure that out, and I don't think it's a solved problem. I think all these problems are not solved problems, but
so you know something about communicating with very distant objects, Paul.
Yeah,
and you see the statistics about the power and the signal from the New Horizons probe, and it's like 10 to the minus 12th times anything we're used to dealing with on Earth.
Well, if you have a 70-meter dish, you can pick it up, that signal up, and make sense of it. But it's a pretty low bit rate. But we're talking about something that's 10 to the 8th weaker. At least 10 to the
8th weaker, maybe more.
Yeah, and what you'd have to do is these probes would have to somehow swarm together and form a large antenna, and you have to get a big aperture because you're not, and then somehow put together enough wattage, a few watts somehow, and then back on our side, you'd have to have some kind of massive,
some orbital telescope,
or on the lunar far side or something that could. It would make the 70-meter dishes of the DSN look like toys, and then you could do it. But again, that's I think that's a problem that is not impossible to solve. It's just a really difficult problem.
But it doesn't seem like something that violates laws of physics.
It doesn't violate the laws of physics. No, you just have. I mean, it's energy per bit, right? If you're okay with a tenth of a bit per second, or because you got lots of time, right? Mm-hmm. Then maybe you could somehow swarm together into an aperture and collect enough energy to get a signal back. Like I said, I don't know the solution. It's a really difficult problem, and on this side, you would need an incredibly sensitive ear. Which, more sensitive than anything we've built so far. Even our receiver would not be good enough.
Would you use radio though, or would you use light? Could they beam back a tight laser beam?
Well, I think you might come up with a clever way to use a different part of the spectrum, but you still have to marshal energy per bit. Maybe little mirrors or something like that could be.
I'm thinking that a laser beam is collimated, and obviously over that sort of distance, it would widen into a pretty huge cone. But nevertheless, it would be pretty well.
Lasers are pretty inefficient energetically, though. That's the problem.
Is that right?
Yeah, I would, but that keeps getting better though. So I would think maybe you could use some kind of signaling mirror approach. Put enough little mirror.
Use the energy from the target star.
Yeah. You're still collecting energy, and you're still redirecting it, but it might be more efficient that way. It's a really, really difficult problem. I don't think it's a solved problem, but you can kind of brute force it on our end. So it's not impossible. I'm skeptical that anybody has a good solution yet.
And what about this issue of not being able to slow down? So was that a problem for Pluto as well?
Sorry, I missed your last sentence there.
Not being able to slow down. I mean, presumably for our probes.
No, that wasn't a problem because of the flyby.
Right, but was the flyby viewed as inferior from a scientific perspective versus?
Well, that. Very early on, it was an obvious fact of life. It was got to be a flyby, and you'd have to carry a much, much larger fuel tank. Essentially, you'd have a big rocket on the end of a big rocket, which it still is well beyond our capability.
Didn't they say though that Falcon Heavy could probably have done it? Falcon Heavy could deliver an orbiter to Pluto. I thought that was one of the things that came up when they successfully launched Falcon Heavy.
It is theoretically possible, yes. Although certainly when we were talking about Atlas or Delta, the biggest rockets we had at the time, it was 1996?
That's true.
96. There was nothing close. In fact, that itself, just getting the flyby together was a bit of a feat, and involved a Jupiter gravity assist. But that, it would be an orbiter would be a lot better. You'd get a ton more data, a ton better coverage. But I think maybe the BFR might be able to deliver that.
I think Elon has certainly claimed that. Yeah.
The BFR is a lot more powerful than the Falcon Heavy. Falcon Heavy's pretty powerful, If you came up with a clever mission design, you might be able to pull it off. But I think actually the bigger priority right now is Uranus and Neptune. So it could be a long time before anybody proposes a Pluto orbiter and gets it approved.
But I think with respect to something like Starship, you're talking about much higher velocities to cross interstellar space, get to another star. So you're accelerating this tiny little thing up to very high velocities and with no intention whatsoever of slowing it down.
And no
at the
ideas
other
for
end.
that, as far as I can tell.
Say again, please.
As far as I can tell, nobody really has an idea for within the next century designing a probe that could both get to another star and slow down.
Well, people have ideas. You can use obvious. The most simplest thing is to fire halfway there and then to fire halfway back. If you've got a rocket that can do that, obviously you couldn't do that with conventional rocket fuel.
Well,
But I assume
rocketry was not going to get you to another star.
Right. Well,
Starshot has gone to this beam propulsion paradigm for a reason, right? Even nuclear rockets don't seem like.
Yeah, nuclear rockets won't make it. You'd have to have something like antimatter or a very sophisticated.
Antimatter or micro black holes or something like that. Because
right, so now we're getting into beyond the realm of what I would consider, say, near-term physics. So.
It's not near-term physics.
Well, antimatter, we know the physics, but we don't know how to build a usable a reactor that can create a usable amount of antimatter. What I would think we could, if you just sit down and play with the numbers of the rocket equation, you get absolutely absurd amounts of fuel. I mean, more than planetary mass, sometimes even more than solar mass, depending on what you assume. And so, that kind of rocket is just silly.
That kind of rocket. That's why people introduced ideas like Bussard ramjets and the like.
Yeah, well, a ramjet picks up the fuel as you go, the rocket equation doesn't apply. But those are really tricky to pull off, and somebody's really engineered one for real. But
no, it's still science fiction.
Yeah, it's not close. Well, it doesn't violate science, but it's a tough engineering problem that we are not.
Well, but we do know that a reflective surface, when you shine electromagnetic radiation on it, will obey Newton's laws, and the physics is pretty straightforward. And we've basically known all the physics since 1905, and so you have a pretty simple game to play, but you have to produce enormous amounts of energy on a very, very small area, and you have to keep steering it very, very accurately for long enough to keep that acceleration going. It's a tough problem. It is not an undoable problem. But as you pointed out, even with anything like a realistic laser or microwave system, we're talking grams of mass that can be accelerated to that level.
And you can't turn around. You can't be from the other side.
Now, Robert Forward did design a system of sails that could be turned around and even return. But
it's using solar.
Yeah, but Forward's design is like a Kardashev Type 2 civilization could pull that off. The amount of energy you have to send out is just ridiculous. It's not ridiculous on a solar scale, but it's ridiculous on a planetary scale.
But it works with beamed power, and it can somehow tack against that and sail up.
Yeah. You can. You should look up Robert Forward. I have a link to it somewhere.
I'll look at that.
He designed it in the I think in the 80s when he was at the Hughes Research Lab, and he was also an active science fiction writer, by the way. And he did. I went to a conference where he presented his concept, and he got gasps from the audience when he said, "Okay, here's how you stop, and basically part of the sail deploys away from the part of the other sail and becomes a secondary reflector. And then finally he says, here's how you actually return, and introduce a tertiary reflector. Now the technology for doing that is far beyond what we can pull off now, but and these would be very, very large. They'd have to be, so you would need materials we don't have and energy levels we don't have, but it's possible in principle.
If you didn't want to slow down, you could probably do a U-turn around the star if you got close enough to come back.
I don't know about a U-turn. You could,
I mean,
if you had multiple stars, you could get enough gravity assist to come back, but it could be very, very, and you need really stars you can get really super close to, have a lot of mass, so neutron stars are best.
Yeah.
If you get,
what's the closest neutron star?
Well, there's lots of them that we probably don't even know they're out there. But at some point we got to figure astronomers will have mapped all the nearby ones. They're tough to observe in a lot of cases. Not all pulsars after all, but neutron stars have been imaged. It's not easy, but it can be done. But the advantage of a neutron star is you can get really close to it, and without getting fried. And
low parallax, yeah.
Right. So you can get a really, really strong gravity system in a neutron star. A black hole is even better.
Except you've got tidal forces to worry about.
Well, you wouldn't get so close that you get ripped apart, but you get pretty close. But actually, a neutron star is probably as good as you possibly could probably use.
I'm thinking of that Larry Niven story, Neutron Star, which is probably the science is completely wrong now, but where someone discovers that going close to a neutron star has strong tidal effects, and the ship gets literally ripped apart.
Well, tidal effects are well understood. Shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those stories which is dated very badly. One other thing Robert Forward wrote, by the way, was the story of life on a neutron star. That's kind of, and he actually had a pretty plausible story there. But yeah, if you could come up with enough neutron stars, you could probably create a matrix where you could do gravity assist.
If you had a few, millennia to wait.
You need a long time, yeah. But let's face it, interstellar travel is going to require the kinds of patience that humanity does not presently. Forget about materials and energy. We don't have the patience.
Nick, what about that ramjet design you mentioned? Is that capable of turning around?
Well, it would be as long as there's sufficient hydrogen that can be scooped up, and you can make a scoop that doesn't have to be made out of physical materials, but you can if you can scoop up enough hydrogen, if you can make fusion out of it, you can go in any direction you want.
Well, the problem is that if you got your scoop, you'd have to turn if you got your scoop turned around, it's not going to get anything. So
I'm thinking about like in the atmosphere, a ramjet with no external fuel. I don't know if it could turn around, right? Because the air that's coming in, the relative velocities, I just don't know if it's.
Well, presumably you would just like when a jet lands and they do full reverse. The things come out behind the jet, so the jet is still facing forward, but its thrust is going in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
You would want to try to do the same thing with the ramjet if you wanted to slow it down.
Yeah, you'd have to figure that out, which is actually non-trivial with a Bussard ramjet.
Agreed. In the classic Poul Anderson novel Tau Zero, basically it's a ramjet that's gone out of control and it's just going so fast that nobody can do anything about it.
They can't stop. Yeah, it's a great story. Yeah, they keep on going and going and going and going, getting faster and faster and faster.
Right.
Relativistic effects get more and more severe, and they basically live to see the end of the galaxy or the end of the
universe. That story made a real impression on me when I read it as a teenager.
Great story.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with a physicist a few weeks ago, And he said, well, we don't know exactly how to do this, but if you could figure out how to get close to the speed of light, you could cover the galaxy in decades, but you can't really go home because the elapsed time will be close to a couple 100,000 years, and it's an unrecognizable planet when you return.
But yeah, you can come home, but it's unrecognizable, and that this is why the twin paradox strikes people as so poignant, and that's what they illustrated they made it personal in the movie Interstellar, where the guy finds his daughter as an old woman. But obviously, if you're going to go to other stars, you're going to take everybody with you. You're going to take the whole family. You're going to take grandma and grandpa. You're going to take all your cousins, and you're going to go someplace with surrounded by the people you want to have with you, going to another world, and so you don't have to come back to Earth. Well, if you want to, you come back and find what Earth looks like in 5 million years, but you don't have to if you don't want to.
The tendency, I think, the strong tendency would be to head out and not come back.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You would take everybody you wanted to have with you, and you would head out, and you would probably not come back.
And when you got to the solar system at the other end, or the star system at the other end, you discover that when you land, that people on Earth several hundred years ago invented an instantaneous method of transfer between stars, and it's all populated by people already. I'm sure there have been stories written like that.
Yeah,
there's been a calculation made. I can't remember the name of it, but there's somebody made the calculation of the wait time, that the optimal time to wait until you make an interstellar flight, because if you go too early, you'll be overtaken, and if you go too late, you miss the boat. So there are people who have studied that.
Yeah. Fun stuff.
It strikes me unlikely that anybody else would go to the same place, though. Just there's too many destinations.
Do you think the Puritans had similar concerns about, waiting for the next fastest form of ship to be invented?
Well, there were people already in the New World. They weren't going to beat them there. They've been there for 14,000 years.
Also those, yeah.
Well, also the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Rock in 1620, so the Spanish had already been in the New World for more than 100 years, but it further south in the Caribbean basin. And
but it is still unpleasant.
The Spaniards had the right idea.
It's still unpleasant to be on a transatlantic voyage for
Caribbean
4
was
months.
Nicer.
Right? So if you wait till the next fastest ship comes out,
I don't think at that time there was much of an idea of technological development as something that rapidly changed societies, which happened after the Industrial Revolution. So there had been, up to that point, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, of robust, transportation by sailing ship. There was no prospect of there being anything better than sailing ships. Nobody really thought about that kind of stuff. So if you were going to go somewhere, you went by sailing ship, and you didn't really question it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that'd have been probably tens of thousands of years that we'd been sailing.
Right, if you count the poly.
Well, the earliest evidence of sailing is actually this tiny little this disc that's a few inches across. It was dug up in Kuwait, it has been interpreted by archaeologists as representing a craft, and I think a sailing craft. I think that's about 6,000 years old. So there's at least 6,000 years worth of evidence of sailing ships. Of course, there were canoes long before that, because Neolithic peoples and Paleolithic peoples used canoes along shoreline to populate the entire planet.
Right. Well, the early Australians got there 40,000 years ago.
Yeah, 60,000 years ago, some people estimate.
Right, and my understanding is they took those canoes to pretty impressive points, right?
The Polynesians spread throughout the entire Pacific, really.
Yeah, and they may have used windlasses of some sort. I'm not sure.
But they used sails, didn't they? They had some.
No, I don't think so.
No.
Some of the Polynesian canoes had sails, but the Polynesians came much later. I mean, the last portions of the South Pacific settled by the Polynesians were only a few thousand years ago, whereas human beings were traveling to other continents, tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah. In the case of New Zealand, it was only a few hundred years ago, really. The Maori just arrived a few hundred years before before Cook came in New Zealand.
Okay.
Well, where are the Maori from? Are they from Australia? From
The Polynesians? No, they're
Polynesian.
from the.
Polynesian people who were among the most aggressive and violent, so they're among the most successful in spreading out and taking over other island societies.
Why did the Maori not really colonize Australia proper?
So who? No, the Aboriginal people in Australia probably came across through Indonesia, and there are some deep gaps in the ocean, some deep parts of the ocean bed, which means that they did have to cross by boat rather than sort of walk when the sea levels were down, which was some of the distance could be covered that way.
But did the Aboriginals repel subsequent waves of colonization from Polynesia?
No, not from Polynesia. No, that didn't happen.
Huh.
No, it's an interesting question. I wonder why the Polynesians didn't attempt to colonize Australia.
Well, it may be just a step too far in terms of distance. Yeah. So they only got to New Zealand in, I think, about the 1300s. It was really not long ago.
Right.
And so maybe they just probably never got as far as Australia, which is just a little bit further.
Right. So that few hundred miles of really deep waters was somehow very.
Yeah.
So in a counterfactual history in which Europeans didn't travel the globe in the way they ended up doing, the Polynesians might have eventually reached Australia.
Sure. Well, that's an interesting alternate history story to be written there, I guess.
Well, maybe they did, but they were made short work of by the people already there.
I think it's the other way around. I think the Maoris would have come in and cleaned up. That's what they did at most other places they went to.
At the very least, you would have expected some sort of record in the Aboriginal storytelling tradition if there'd been invaders from a foreign land.
Also, you would have found the distinctive cultivars and animals that they would have brought with them on their boats, which they brought pigs and chickens and particular
delicious poi.
What is that made from? Coconut?
Taro root, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I'm not a fan, but the Hawaiians love it.
Well, let's see.
So we got kind of off topic, I guess.
Yeah.
There is no topic.
It's a non-episode.
I wanted to get Mike to weigh in. Mike's a power engineer. He knows a lot. I want to add about the risk to the power grid. I kind of dialing back about 30 minutes here. Mike, what do you think about the risks to the power grid from natural effects versus Russian hackers?
It's probably about a 50-50. Power distribution is a weird area. I've listened to engineers talk about different aspects. Basically, the at least the North American and probably the European power grid is pretty robust. It can handle some seriously hits from electromagnetic, because they're watching everything from thunderstorms. They're on almost like a minute to minute situation. As far as thunderstorms that are crossing the country, and they're watching they're getting the direct feeds right from the NOAA's weather or space weather. So they're watching, and when a mass ejection happens, they're ready to deal with it. They'll start rerouting and setting up switches and stuff like that. I don't know about outside the United States. And also the United States there's actually 3 grids. 2 of them work together, 1 doesn't. Texas is on its own grid. So, and they're actually mostly on solar. Much of their energy is coming from solar. East and West, I believe it's still primarily coal or nuclear, but wind power is becoming quite popular. So if something happened, one grid, and if I'm understanding it correctly, and when I last looked at it, there were no interconnections to Texas. Texas has no connection to the North American grid. East, West, Canada, Mexico, Central America are all interconnected. Texas, actually, I think parts of Oklahoma, I think those are, they're all separate. I think there may be one or two interconnects, but they can isolate themselves. If something happens to the North America, Texas can stay on its own and run on its own, or opposite. If Texas got hit with something serious, they're going to be stuck because they can't get from the rest of the grid. But everything is, I mean, all the power companies are so interconnected, and they know what's going on. And if a particular grid's having problems, other grids can pick up the slack and so on. And then if something was going to happen, they can start adjusting for it. And that's just for the normal, everyday, just your average ejection or magnetic event from the sun. Very much like how satellites, they, when they get the report that it's like what they got 15 minutes to an hour from the time they detect something on the sun to it hits the Earth. So, I mean, most satellites, they'll go into whatever mode, or I think they turn their antennas or whatever they do to avoid the any nasty hits. And then if you go into the hacking side, getting to some homeland security stuff, but if a Russian hacker can get in and get to the generator, there's a bigger problem than just that, that they can do that. Most of the places I worked at, you physically can't get from the outside of the plant into the inner workings of the control room. They're air gapped. There's an air gap between those, or there should be. Every place I've been. So if something happens that is hacker related in a plant, that was done by somebody physically putting some piece of hardware in that plant. In Iran, the centrifuge.
Yeah, right. We got around that in that case.
Someone physically programmed. It was a physically hard coded into the centrifuges to, when certain conditions happen, it was supposed to, basically it'll destroy itself. That was not triggered from outside. That had to happen inside. And according to everything I've read, it was was it Siemens or ABB, whoever made the centrifuges, actually put code on inside the drives.
But it was I think it was a USB drive, right?
Nope. It was hard programmed into the firmware of the drive.
Right, but how did the mail code get into that firmware across the air gap?
It didn't. It was purposely installed by the manufacturer into the chip.
Oh, I see. Like we just corrupted Siemens or whatever, or
before delivery and before use, it was there.
I see.
Right. They put that code in there purposely to destroy those centrifuges.
Gives you a lot of confidence in Siemens if you buy their hardware.
Yeah, that raises some questions because, I mean, like I said, I work a lot with these drives, and they're using them for basically some mission critical type operations. And if that drive fails on some type of bad code, there'd be like a little crater where a refinery used to be. But apparently, I don't know how they convinced them to
how much of the hardware is imported from China?
Oh, probably about 90%. probably the chips and the circuit boards.
Yeah, so no way that there's any bad firmware on that, right?
No. Actually, I'm kind of amazed. I used to think that way, but the stuff that's coming out of China is pretty decent. Now, you got to be real careful, though, that you're dealing with the reputable Chinese, because there's some of the unscrupulous groups that will, especially with metallurgy, because if you're buying, you're buying bolts. You're expecting these bolts to hold. I'm trying to avoid getting into some technical stuff here, but you've got a pipe that's rated for 150 pounds, so that the bolt has to, when you torque it down, it's supposed to stretch a certain, and you get the metallurgy has to be just right to make that all hold together, because these plants those bolts may have to stay together for 40 years. A lot of times the Chinese will fudge the metallurgy. They might throw in some extra scrap metal when they shouldn't have, or something like that. And if they doctor their documentation, yeah, you can run into some trouble having, again, if you're in a refinery and all of a sudden your pipes start delaminating or start coming apart, flanges come apart. Yeah, spraying gasoline at 600 degrees is not going to, you're going to have some problems there. But actually, I think the worst out of the Chinese has been the herbal, I was watching this. The alternative medicine type stuff, or the I keep wanting to say additives, but it's the
supplements.
Supplements, that's it. Because again, a lot of times the Chinese, they'll market something like something root or whatever it is, that's supposed to be good for erectile dysfunction. But you know what? When they do the analysis, they find Viagra in it.
Well, the Chinese will sell infant formula with poison in it, so
exactly.
You'll be well advised to buy elsewhere when your health.
The manufacturers of cheap.
Well, I guess it doesn't seem like
physical infrastructure have to compete with manufacturers of high quality infrastructure. Yeah. It's more like industrial control systems where the firmware could be compromised and nobody knows about it for years until it's triggered by some external signal, right? Like the Stuxnet case.
Yeah. Like I said, a lot of the stuff I've worked with, it is really robust. I've only one place where I've seen where there was a real issue with something. It was, I won't go into too many, I don't want to go into too many details, but it's basically, for some reason, this, it was the IO to the DCS. And for some reason, these modules decided, I'm done, I'm shutting off. And they just, and this was in a refinery, and all of a sudden all your control systems shut off on you. And fortunately, there's the mechanical, the mechanical safeties. They start venting, and the flare, gases end up going into the flare instead of whatever. They start, or things will depressurize, or
So was that sort of incident viewed as a potential cybersecurity penetration?
It shouldn't, because again, you got this air gap between the outside world and the internal controls.
Right, but if the vendor was compromised and then somebody was sloppy about putting a USB stick where they shouldn't,
Well, again, now the USB thing has happened, but they have, I know at some places you can lose your job if you have a USB card in your pocket or in your briefcase or whatever.
Yeah, it's extremely frowned upon. I've been United States Air Force installations where whipping out a USB stick is.
But can they really stop people
pretty
from
much
charging their iPhones on the USB port on their
with dogs
on
top of you?
Well, again,
like it doesn't have to be a literal USB stick, right? It could be anything with a USB, an interface.
They will
allow you on the IT side, on the
They will not have externally accessible USB ports in some cases.
If you're on the IT
for that very
side,
reason. People charge their iPhones on the wall,
with the controls,
which is fine.
Then sometimes they'll let you use it, but even then, some employers, you can't even bring them through. You can't even bring your cell phone into the plants. You leave in the car.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I've been places where, the cell phone you leave in a locker outside. Yeah. And stricter than that even. But
everything.
I buy Chinese hardware all the time. I don't even realize it till I look at where it came from. And and some of it's actually quite good.
The whole point is to make it work seamlessly, even while there are back doors that are engineered into everything. I mean, there was after the Snowden revelations, I think a lot of network router makers, it was revealed, were working with various governments around the world to have a lot of back ports in. And the whole idea is to have them work really well, and nobody knows when they're losing data over them.
Yeah. Well, there was.
It's human, yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I think that most people realize, just as with Snowden, the biggest risk is not.
Well, one of the earliest conspiracies I ran across was this. There was somebody who was claiming that I forget who it was, and they had basically these routers set up at I believe it. The main trunk, there's a main trunk line that comes into the United States, and I forget if it's through San Francisco or Seattle. And there's a off-limits room with these routers that actually copies the data. So the data goes through, this will be phone calls, whatever's coming through. They'll copy it, and then they send it to the... and they didn't, I don't remember if the conspiracy actually said NSA. But I kind of wrote it off because the United States spies on, I've read stuff about during World War II or many of the magic messages from Japan to their embassy in Washington was being intercepted at the RCA station I think it was on Bainbridge Island in Seattle. And then it was sent, they were copying it, sending it to, to the guys that were working the magic machine, the
purple,
purple machine. So I knew that kind of stuff was going on. So when I heard this, I go, okay, that's probably what's going on. But they're trying to make it sound like that they're eavesdropping. But then Snowden comes along and kind of like, okay, they were really doing a lot more. Whether they were doing it at that time versus now, I don't know, but it's like, okay, there's a conspiracy that I actually believe was a conspiracy, but maybe not, or it was a lot worse than maybe what I was assuming it was, but certainly.
Well, it's also like a conspiracy that most people expect is going on, and some people would say would be negligent if it wasn't going on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but yeah,
somehow it's on a different level than most conspiracies that you analyze on your show.
Speaking of conspiracy theories, I'd be interested to get Mike Bohler's take on the coordinated deplatforming of Alex Jones and InfoWars.
Yeah.
Oh.
In our timely news of the day segment.
Oh yeah. You know what? I'm so confused. I'm really. I mean, it's because you got what's going on in the real world. Alex Jones has promoted some pretty nasty stuff. He's been a believer that the Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax. All the shootings in the United States have been a hoax, and people have taken to that and ran with it. There was, I think, Vice did a show on those. What's that guy's name? The Sidethorn, and he hangs around with Conspiracy Granny. Okay. And they were in Texas after the Parkland shooting, harassing. This guy was a pastor in this church, and whose kid had been killed in this shooting, and these two were harassing this guy that it was all fake, and they wanted to see the death certificate and a birth certificate. They were just, and actually, as they were doing this, the part of this thing for Vice, the police showed up and arrested them. And last I heard, Sidethorn, again, I don't know his real name, but he's got a number of counts thrown at him. And on top of it, he was already a parolee, and he had a gun with him, and that violated his parole. So he's in all sorts of trouble just to harass this guy. And Conspiracy Granny's also, she wasn't arrested, she wasn't held, but then she was arrested as an accomplice or whatever. They were able to charge her with it. But these are people, Pizzagate. Jones has promoted this Pizzagate conspiracy, and again, a guy shows up with a rifle. I forget if he had an AR-15 or whatever he had, and but of course, this is Jones and many of his. People. There are people who promoted this, and then Jones gives it a forum on his show, and finally, someone is saying that this, are realizing what this guy's been doing, and decided, and he's, that they determined that he's promoting violence. So Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify decided enough's enough. We're kicking you off. We've given you warnings, and
okay. It was Apple who came in first and took him out of the iTunes podcast index, basically. Yeah.
Although apparently the Overcast guy had already manually overridden the iTunes index and removed him from Overcast.
Oh, that's interesting.
They just took his app off. His podcast still stays on there.
I think it's the other way around. I think they left the app.
I can get it. I've been getting it, and I doubt every day he puts it out, for research purposes. And he's still on there, and actually he does run a bunch of different shows, but there's the one that you'll still find one on iTunes. It's his regular 4-hour show, and I actually found an article, and it makes sense that there's Blueberry. They recommend that you hold on to your RSS feed. That's the key to a podcast, or getting a podcast published, is your RSS feed. Apparently, Jones is maintaining his own RSS feed. So, once it's in there, apparently, once that RSS, and you can still get to it. Even if iTunes did decide to, because they have to expunge the whole thing, you can still go to that RSS feed and start getting the shows again.
That's right, and anybody can make a new aggregator that just searches the web for RSS feeds of podcasts. It's not, right. Apple doesn't have a monopoly over this. Yeah. It's just that most podcast app developers are too lazy to make.
Right.
No. Yeah. It's just an index.
Crawl the web to index them. Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Apple doesn't.
Surely the point here is that you've got all these companies that we've talked about are all private companies.
Right.
They're not. They have absolute right to decide what appears on their platforms and what doesn't.
Yeah.
I think that's perfectly straightforward.
Yeah, that's been the general argument from all because there's been hundreds of articles. Every news outlet has put out a story on it, and it's the same thing. They're private companies. They get, if you violate their rules of conduct or their basic their basic rules, they'll kick you off.
Yeah, right. But the counter argument, of course, is that if the federal government can force a cake baker to bake a gay wedding cake, well, why is the private industry in that case forced to conform, where in the case of these big tech giants and their social media platforms, they basically have carte blanche? Yeah, they're big, they have lots of money, they're well connected, they have good lawyers.
Yeah.
And the other argument that's very common now is that they have become the equivalent of public utilities, that free speech means nothing if anybody can get, if you're only going to cherry pick who can talk on really big platforms like Twitter and YouTube, then you're not getting any kind of robust public debate. But of course, if we had completely free markets, that wouldn't be a big deal because a competitor could come in and undercut them. But since these big tech social media giants are all operating at a loss, you can't come in and undercut YouTube because they're not making any money.
I think YouTube is doing just fine.
Well, they pass along advertising revenues to some of their creators.
YouTube makes a lot of.
But as a company, they don't make any money.
But
really,
maybe they will.
You don't think they're one of the most? I thought they were one of the more profitable divisions of Alphabet.
There is. I don't know the numbers. I don't have it in front of me. I'm repeating stuff that I've heard on.
There's a
various,
huge amount of advertising on YouTube. Yeah,
well, their good reasons are ideological reasons. I mean, Google is an extremely ideological company, and they want to try to, force the public narrative to assume a certain shape. Yeah.
Spotify may be a better example because Spotify definitely is operating at a loss.
Right.
But also a very rich company, and
right.
But yeah, let's see. Then Jones.
Spotify may not be around for much longer, but.
He starts, and this is where it gets kind of weird, that he starts claiming that that his site is being attacked by Chinese hackers.
I heard about that.
Yeah. Well, apparently, according to Jones, Apple is paying these Chinese hackers to take down his site, his regular InfoWars site. And I've been trying to do some research on how his site operates, because I can't. I'm doing whois searches, and I'm trying to dig into who owns, who hosts his site, and the best I can tell is that Jones runs his own servers, and it seems strange to me that if InfoWars is under attack, the domain, and again, I'm not that tech savvy, so I may be missing some aspects here, but. If they're going after InfoWars, that should be compromising his entire server, not just InfoWars, because he also operates 5 other websites under his umbrella. And even as this was going on, he was live streaming his show. Started putting his show out on a 24-hour basis. And I'm thinking, if his site is being attacked and being brought down, so to speak, how is he getting a live feed off his servers into the internet? So I'm thinking he's actually, this is a fake attack. I
mean, the Occam's razor has to be that he's full of shit, right? I mean, come on.
Well, the guy will do anything. And the thing is, if you go to the Infowars.com, you'll see like this. You'll see a list of his websites plus a link to the products he sells. He sells supplements and
Super Male Vitality.
Yeah,
See,
Right.
when the apocalypse comes.
And then donate to his site. So what he's trying to do is get donations from his followers. He's under attack, sending money so we can fight the powers that are trying to take us down. And he's talking, and he was, talking about.
But they definitely are trying to take him down, right? That much is true.
Well, the social media companies are going to take him down. The next level of attack would be for the payment processors to shut him down, which is what happened with people like Andrew Anglin's Stormfront and the alt-right and their website for a while.
Or if he relies on
WikiLeaks,
Cloudflare for DDoS protection.
Yeah. So there are additional levels that the powers that be could go in throttling back Alex Jones if they want. There's still several platforms he can still use, like BitChute and things like that. If he can still get the word out, he can still his dedicated followers will follow him wherever he goes, and they will continue to support him wherever he goes. Yeah. But when you lose, things like YouTube, the casual viewers and the people who just tune in say, oh, what are the nut jobs saying this week? They won't follow because they don't care enough.
Right. Yeah, I think it's sort of interesting in terms of an analogy with like eras in our history where we felt like free press was particularly valuable. Like Thomas Paine printing his pamphlets, right? He wasn't relying upon whatever the analog of the New York Times was in colonial America to publish his writings. And probably there was some sort of suppression that went on.
Well, there was a, who was it? Was it not Adams? Trying to remember the presidents now, because there was
the Alien and Sedition Act you're thinking of after the revolution.
Yeah, there was that, and they were trying to shut down some of the presses.
Yeah, well, throughout ever shortly after Gutenberg invented the movable type press, all the governments of Europe, such as they were at the time, they licensed it and they tried to control it. They couldn't completely control it, but in some cases they could partially control it. So, people set up, just like under the Soviet communism, people had samizdat and would use whatever means they had, whether typewriters or fax machines or mimeographs to try to get the word out. But it's a cat and mouse game between the people who have the police and the guns and the people who are trying to get the word out.
Right. And so I guess I have enough, I'm pretty civil libertarian, so my instinct is not to be blasé about the government suppressing speech, but in terms of private entities limiting means of access for dissident voices, I find it hard to be concerned because of the whole information wants to be free phenomenon. You'd like to imagine that if somebody was publishing some sort of samizdat that Twitter and Facebook didn't want you to see, but was nonetheless important, that it would still get out there. Somebody can host their own website in plain old HTML. It's not very expensive to put up content.
I agree with that, but I think the first 20 years of YouTube or something were a really unique moment in history in terms of free expression, because if you could get in front of a camera and be entertaining and people wanted to watch you, not only could you do it, but you could get paid for it. And that created this whole slew of content producers who created enormous amounts of content for YouTube until they started throwing back both on the ad revenue and people because community guidelines.
Right. He's right to me. As a netizen, I'm a little bit worried that you lose some vitality of these platforms by tightening them up in ways that are not universally accepted, but I don't find it a particularly concerning development in terms of even the culture of free speech, setting aside the legalities, which we all agree are beside the point, because as everybody said, this is a private company. They can do what they want. There's no constitutional objection. There's perhaps a culture of free speech type objection. I don't find it so worrisome in terms of restricting our politics, but this broader point about we had something pretty good going on with a very open internet. Are we poisoning that somehow as it becomes more walled garden and tightened down?
Yeah. I mean, the great thing about the internet was that you can have a debate online. You can You can argue whatever point. And I'm kind of concerned that with what's happening to Jones may spread into other areas. I mean, I tend to might have some opinions that don't necessarily fit well with various groups. I won't go into those, but if it was decided that, I try to be civil about the way I do it, and I try to be honest. I mean, when I do my show, and I try to take a more honest and realistic approach. I mean, I don't like Donald Trump, but I think I'm hoping I'm doing it for the right reasons that I don't like Trump. Just, I didn't like Obama, and there was reasons I think I had legitimate reasons to dislike him. So it's that type of thing. But Jones goes beyond that, and that's why I have no. I mean, I think it's great that he's being kicked off the trying to be kicked off the air, trying to be shut down, because for the past 20 years he's claimed that, and if you watch he did an interview with Joe Rogan, and in some of his beliefs kind of came out, because apparently if you get some alcohol in him and maybe some marijuana, he does.
I saw that interview. It's definitely true.
Yeah. He starts, because when he started talking about that fifth dimension demons past, to, I mean, that's the type of stuff that, and on top, well, there's that type of stuff that really makes no sense, and he's just being, he's being weird. And the fact you can't debate with the guy, he will not allow you to debate. He'll sit there. I mean, if you watch the Piers Morgan interview he had on CNN, that guy spent the whole 5 minutes yelling at Piers Morgan, calling him whatever. He was gun hating, whatever. What is it? I think he was
MI6.
Oh, what was he calling him on that? He was like, I think it had to. I don't know if he was calling him, you limey bastard, you come to this country and try to take our guns away from us, and just kept going and going and going. And Pierce just actually sat back and let him do this for the whole show. And then after the commercial came back, Pierce said a few words, and then Jones was back. There's no way to have a debate with that guy. I mean, it's like trying to debate young Earth creationists. You're not gonna convince them, and you go into a debate with those types, the Gish Gallop types and all this kind of stuff. You're not going to get. It's not a debate.
That's true. It's not a debate, but as soon as you suppress it, everything they say becomes true. They say the government is trying to shut us down, and then these big companies, tech companies, martyr him and prove him right. That is really bad.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we should wrap up now. We've been talking for a long time. We will be back on August 31st, live on YouTube. And if you want to know what the link for that is, I'll post it on Twitter at Podcast Unseen. And I think we've had a really good discussion. We could carry on for a long time. And we will. So by all means, feel free to weigh in on the topic for August 31st. It's not settled yet. And I'll post links for that in the show notes at unseenpodcast.com. So just go to unseenpodcast.com. You can learn anything you want about this episode and about the podcast in general. I'd like to thank David Grigg. Thank you, David, for holding up through the windy morning, I guess, windy afternoon.
Thank you.
And Mike Bohler.
Yep. Thank you for having me on.
By the way, check out Mike's Skeptic's Guide to Conspiracy, wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. And
for now,
Nick Nielsen.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, until he gets kicked off. And Sam Lichtenstein.
Thanks.
And we'll be back again, as I mentioned, in 2 weeks. If you want to contact us directly, you can email unseenpodcast@gmail.com, or you can come over to our Google Plus discussion groups, and we'll have those are all those links are available at unseenpodcast.com. Please, the best way to get this podcast is to subscribe. Just go to your favorite podcast aggregator on your smartphone or your tablet or your computer, subscribe. And by the way, our RSS feed URL is on the same website. There's a link to it there. And it's available in pretty much all the quality podcast apps, and including even on Apple Podcasts, if we want to stretch that quality definition a little bit. And we will, if you subscribe, then it'll automatically show up on your podcast app every time we put one out. Which it's been every 2 weeks. We're going to try to get to every 1 week. That is something I'll discuss with you more in the future. So it is still just barely the 17th of August 2018, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.